The medical bay reeked of death and desperation. Healer Vellana's 6 arms, once graceful instruments of healing, now shook like autumn leaves as the shadow plague consumed her from within. Her blue skin, which had glowed with bioluminescent health just days ago, was turning black at the edges, the telltale sign that her life force was being devoured by something that shouldn't exist. Around her, the crystalline halls of the Thylorian medical complex echoed with sounds no parent should ever hear. Children crying in languages that were becoming whispers, families holding each other as their loved ones simply faded. The plague didn't just kill, it erased. It turned light into darkness, hope into void, existence into nothing. Vellana stumbled toward the emergency communication array, her movements jerky and uncontrolled. Each step felt like walking through molasses made of her own failing nervous system. The irony wasn't lost on Hershey, who had dedicated her life to healing, was now watching helplessly as an entire civilization died around her. The quantum communicator hummed to life, its alien interface responding to her touch, despite her deteriorating condition. She had maybe minutes before the plague reached her brainstem, maybe less. But this message, this desperate, impossible message, had to get out, light years away. Commander Lisa Hayes was nursing her 3rd cup of synthetic coffee and wondering why she'd volunteered for monitoring duty on deep space. Station Alpha said the coffee tasted like recycled air filters, and the shift had been mind-numbingly quiet. Just another boring night in the armpit of the galaxy, watching for signals that never came from civilizations that pretended humans didn't exist. Then her console exploded with activity. The subspace transmission hit the station's receivers like a sledgehammer to the skull. Warning lights bathed the command center in pulsing red as every sensor array screamed in unison. Lisa's coffee mug shattered on the floor as she lunged for her controls, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What the hell?" she started, then stopped cold as the transmission resolved into something impossible. A dying alien face filled her screen. This is Healer Vellana of the Thylorian Republic," the creature gasped, and Lisa felt her world tilt sideways. The Thylorians hadn't spoken to humans in 3 decades. Not since the exile. Not since they voted to banish Earth's fleet beyond the galactic rim because humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous for civilized space. Vellana's voice cracked like breaking glass. "The shadow plague. It's killing us all. Our children are dying in the thousands." Lisa's hands froze over her console. Children. The word hit her like a physical blow. She thought of her own daughter back on Earth, safe and laughing and alive. The thought of children dying while she sat here drinking bad coffee made her stomach lurch. But then Vellana said something that made Lisa's blood turn to ice water in her veins. We're calling the humans." Time seemed to stop. The background hum of the station faded to nothing. Lisa could hear her own heartbeat, thundering in her ears, as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami of terrible possibility. They were calling the humans. The same humans they'd exiled. The same humans they'd branded as monsters and Deathworlders, and savages too brutal for polite galactic society. The humans they'd cast out into the darkness beyond the spiral arm and told never to return. Now they wanted those monsters back. Vellana's image flickered as her life signs weakened. "Please," she whispered, and Lisa had never heard such raw desperation in a voice before. "We know you hate us for casting you out, but we're begging you. Save our children." The screen went black. Lisa stared at the dead display, her reflection ghost-like in the dark surface. Behind her, the station's mixed alien Crucentorians, vegan scouts, a couple of silicon-based Cristarchs, stood frozen in shock. She could feel their fear radiating outward like heat from a furnace. They all knew what this meant. They all understood the terrible mathematics of the situation. The Thylorians were the galaxy's premier healers. If they couldn't stop this plague, no one could. No one in civilized space, anyway. But beyond the rim, in the cold darkness, where civilized species feared to tread, there was another option: the human fleet. Earth's exiled armada. 300 warships crewed by the most dangerous, most adaptably, most absolutely ruthless species the galaxy had ever produced. Humans who had been forged in the fires of a death world and tempered by 30 years of bitter exile. "Commander," whispered Zektar, her Centaurian communications officer, his 4 eyes wide with terror. "Are you going to forward this message?" Lisa's finger hovered over the transmission relay. One touch would send Valana's desperate plea racing through subspace toward the rim, toward the waiting human fleet, toward Admiral Jack Morrison and his battle-hardened veterans who had been nursing their anger and their exile for 3 long decades. But forwarding this message would be like opening Pandora's box. The humans wouldn't just come to help, they'd come home, and they wouldn't be the same species that had been exiled 30 years ago. Exile changed people, hardened them, made them into something sharper and more dangerous than they'd been before. "The treaty," Zektar stammered. "The Galactic Council's orders. Humans are forbidden from entering civilized space. If we call them back." "Children are dying," Lisa said quietly, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "That's the only law that matters now." She thought about the chain of command, about protocols and procedures, and the political firestorm this would create. Then she thought about children dying of a plague that turned their very life force into shadow. Her finger came down on the transmission key. The message raced outward, through subspace, carrying with it 30 years of exile, desperation, and the terrifying hope that sometimes the monsters you fear most are the only ones who can save you, in the depths of space. Beyond the rim where civilized species dared not venture, ancient sensors stirred to life. Warning beacons began to flash. Emergency protocols, dormant for 3 decades, suddenly activated. The sleeping giant was beginning to wake, and this time, it wasn't waking up angry. It was waking up to save the very people who had cast it out, into the darkness. But would salvation come with a price that the galaxy was prepared to pay? The war room of the U.S. Vengeance had seen better days. Hell, it had seen better decades. Scorch marks from a Krellan plasma attack still decorated the bulkheads, and the tactical hologram flickered occasionally where shrapnel had damaged the projectors during the Battle of Kepler's Edge. But Admiral Jack Morrison wouldn't have it any other way. Battle scars told stories, and this room had plenty to tell. Morrison stood at the center of the tactical display, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the swirling galaxies of light before him. At 62, he looked older. Exile had a way of adding years to a man's face. The scar running from his left temple to his jaw, courtesy of a Vorthan boarding party, had turned silver with age. His once dark hair was now iron gray, cropped military short. But his eyes, those cold blue eyes that had stared down alien admirals in cosmic horrors, alike those hadn't aged a day. Behind him, his senior staff waited in that particular silence that comes before a storm. These weren't the fresh-faced academy graduates he'd commanded 3 decades ago. Exile had burned away the weak ones, leaving only the hardest, most adaptable survivors. They were predators now. Sharks who had learned to thrive in the deep, dark waters beyond the galaxy's edge. Captain Emily Carter stood at his right shoulder, her augmented left eye glowing a soft red in the dim lighting. The cybernetic implant had been a necessity after the siege of Proxima Station, where she'd taken shrapnel to save a squad of Marines. The eye could see across 17 different spectrums and calculate firing solutions faster than most ship computers. But right now, it was focused on the incoming data stream with laser intensity. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying that particular blend of military precision and barely controlled fury that came from 30 years of wanting to go home. "The alien distress call is confirmed. Shadow plague, consuming energy-based life forms across 17 star systems." 17 systems. Morrison felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Thylorian Republic alone had 12 billion souls. Add in the Centaurian colonies, the vegan trade networks, the crystal cities of the Silicate Collective, ... They were looking at genocide on a scale that made human wars look like playground squabbles, confirmed casualties. He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. 2 billion dead in the first wave, Carter replied, her augmented eye flickering as she processed the data. Mortality rate is climbing exponentially. Their medical facilities are overwhelmed. Their fleets are falling back to quarantine positions, but the plague is spreading faster than they can contain it. Morrison's jaw clenched, until the muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. The same aliens who voted to exile us, he said, his voice carrying 3 decades of bitter memory. Who called us savages, who said we were too violent for civilized space. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The galaxy's most civilized species, beings of pure energy and crystalline perfection, were being consumed by something that turned their very existence into shadow. Meanwhile, the savage humans they'd banished were the only ones who might be able to help. Commander Marcus Webb shifted uncomfortably at Morrison's left. His mechanical arm worried softly as servo motors compensated for damaged nerves. He'd lost the original arm during the evacuation of Colony 7, crushed while holding a bulkhead closed so civilians could escape. The replacement was military grade, capable of crushing steel or performing microsurgery with equal precision. Right now, it was clenched into a fist. Their children are dying, Jack, Webb said quietly, and Morrison could hear the weight of fatherhood in his voice. Webb had 3 kids back on New Terra, part of the generation born in exile, billions of them, children. The word hit Morrison like a physical blow. He thought of his own grandson, little Tommy, who'd never seen Earth's blue skies or felt its yellow sun on his face. Tommy, who'd grown up hearing stories about the homeworld from a grandfather, branded as a monster by the very species now begging for help. The holographic star map rotated slowly before them, showing the plague's advance in sickening detail. Red zones spread like cancer through civilized space, consuming worlds that had stood for millennia. The Thylorian capital, once a beacon of healing and hope, was now a dying ember, surrounded by quarantined ships. But it was the smaller markers that made Morrison's blood boil: the refugee camps, the medical stations, the evacuation routes clogged with families fleeing something they couldn't fight, couldn't understand, couldn't escape. Status of the fleet, he asked, though he already knew the answer. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Stone, his chief of staff, stepped forward with military precision. At 45, she was the youngest member of his senior command, but exile had forged her into something harder than diamond. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her green eyes held the kind of focus that came from surviving battles that should have killed everyone involved. 312 vessels combat ready, she reported crisply. The Retribution, Defiance, and Indomitable finished repairs yesterday. Ammunition stores are at 93%. Fuel reserves sufficient for extended operations. All ships are crewed by experienced veterans with an average of 28 years combat experience. 28 years. Morrison almost smiled at that. In the regular military, 10 years made you a veteran. In the exile fleet, 28 years made you barely qualified to serve coffee in the mess hall. These weren't just soldiers, they were survivors of every nightmare the galaxy could throw at them. His fleet hung motionless in the void beyond the rim. 300 human warships that represented the finest and most dangerous force in known space. Each ship was battle-tested, jury-rigged, and crewed by people who'd learned to thrive in impossible conditions. They were predators who'd been exiled to the deep ocean, only to discover they preferred the hunting grounds. Out there in the dark, the Vengeance itself was a testament to human adaptability. Originally a standard dreadnought, 30 years of combat and creative engineering had transformed her into something unique. Krellin shield generators boosted her defenses. Captured Vorthan weapons systems gave her teeth that could bite through any known armor. Thylorian medical bays taken as salvage from derelict ships kept her crew healthy despite the hazardous conditions beyond the rim. She was a patchwork warship held together by determination and spite, crewed by the galaxy's most dangerous outcasts. In other words, she was perfectly human. Sir, Stone continued, I have to remind you that our exile orders are still in effect. Galactic Council Resolution 2847 specifically prohibits human vessels from entering civilized space under penalty of Colonel Morsoon interrupted, his voice cutting through her words like a blade. Are you about to tell me that following regulations is more important than saving lives? Stone's cheeks flushed, but she held her ground. Sir, I'm saying that if we violate the exile, we'll be branded as invaders. Every species in the galaxy will unite against us. We'll be at war with everyone. Morrison turned to face her fully, and Stone took an involuntary step back. There was something in the Admiral's eyes, something cold and predatory, and absolutely implacable. It was the look of a man who'd made his choice, and damned the consequences. Colonel Stone, he said quietly, 30 years ago, they called us monsters, and threw us out into the dark. We've spent 3 decades proving them right, becoming exactly what they feared we were. But you know what the difference is between a monster and a hero. Stone shook her head, unable to look away from those terrible blue eyes. A hero saves people who deserve it. A monster saves people who don't. Morrison's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Their children are dying, and I'll be damned if I let politics keep us from doing what's right. He turned back to the tactical display, watching the red zones spread like blood and water. Somewhere out there, alien children were taking their last breaths, while their parents wept in languages humanity had never bothered to learn. Somewhere out there, the same beings who'd cast them out were discovering that civilization was just a thin veneer over the chaos that lurked beneath. All ships, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying across the fleet's communication network. Battle stations. This is Admiral Morrison. We've received a distress call from the Thylorian Republic. They're facing an extinctional-level plague, and they've asked for our help. He paused, letting that sink in. 300 ships holding 60,000 of humanity's finest warriors, all waiting for his next words. I know what you're thinking. These are the same aliens who exiled us, who called us savages and monsters and Deathworlders, too dangerous for polite society. They made their choice 30 years ago, and we've been living with the consequences ever since. Another pause. Morrison could feel the tension rippling through the fleet, the mixture of anger and anticipation that came before battle. But here's the thing about being human: we don't abandon children. We don't let innocents die because their parents made bad choices. We're going home, people. We're going to save lives. And if anyone has a problem with that, ... Morrison's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. Well, they can take it up with our gunnery crews. The Vengeance roared to life around him, her massive engines blazing white-hot fury against the cosmic dark. All across the fleet, ships that had been dormant for months suddenly burned with purpose. Weapon systems came online with predatory hums. Shield generators spun up to full power. The exile fleet transformed from a collection of sleeping giants into a pack of awakened wolves. Sir, Stone said quietly, our exile orders are void the moment children started dying. Morrison snarled, and for the first time in 30 years, he felt truly alive. When someone calls for help, you answer. Even if they hate you for it. Especially if they hate you for it. The fleet began to move, 300 human warships turning as one toward the heart of civilized space. Behind them, the dark emptiness of exile. Ahead, a galaxy that had cast them out now desperately needed their help. The Deathworlders were coming home, and God help anyone who stood in their way. The Galactic Defense Command headquarters had been designed to inspire awe and confidence. Towering crystalline spires reached toward the stars, their surfaces alive with flowing data streams and tactical displays. The command center itself was a marvel of alien engineering, a vast circular chamber where representatives from 17 different species coordinated the defense of civilized space. Today, it looked more like a madhouse. Warning klaxons screamed through the crystal halls as every sensor array in the sector lit up like a Christmas tree. Holographic displays flickered and sparked with incoming data streams that made no sense, couldn't possibly be real, and yet were undeniably there. The humans were coming home. General Thalos stood at the center of the chaos, his 9-foot reptilian frame radiating fury and disbelief. His scales, normally a dignified bronze, had darkened to the mottled green that indicated extreme stress among his species. The ceremonial war crest along his spine stood fully erect, making him look even more imposing than usual. But imposing wasn't going to stop what was racing toward them through the void. "How many ships?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the noise like a plasma sword. Lieutenant Velkos, a nervous Centaurian with 4 eyes that darted between displays, stammered out the numbers. 312 confirmed contacts, sir, all bearing human energy signatures, all moving at maximum burn toward the inner systems. 300 ships. Thalos felt something cold settle in his chest. The entire galactic defense fleet, at full strength, numbered barely 400 vessels. And they weren't at full strength. The plague had hit the energy-based species hardest, leaving gaping holes in their defensive formations. "Status of our forces?" Thalos asked, though he dreaded the answer. Commander Zorax, a crystalline being whose faceted surface reflected the command center's lights in rainbow patterns, spoke with the musical tones of his people. 40% of our ships are in quarantine zones, attempting to contain the plague. Another 20% are evacuating civilian populations. We have perhaps 120 vessels available for immediate deployment. 120 ships against 300, and those 300 were crewed by the most dangerous warriors the galaxy had ever produced, humans who'd been exiled for being too violent, too unpredictable, too damn good at killing things. But numbers weren't the worst part. The worst part was that deep down, in a place he'd never admit existed, Thalos was relieved they were coming. Because if the humans couldn't stop this plague, nothing could. "Block them," he roared, slamming his clawed fist down on the command table hard, enough to crack the crystal surface. "All remaining ships, form a defensive line at the Meridian Gate. Those savages cannot be allowed to enter civilized space." The command center erupted into organized chaos as orders flew across subspace channels. Ships that had been guarding refugee convoys suddenly changed course. Medical vessels found themselves pressed into combat duty. Even training cruises filled with academy cadets were called to the line. But Thalos knew it was theater. They were going through the motions because protocol demanded it, because their pride required it, because admitting the truth that they needed the exiled monsters would shatter everything the Galactic Council stood for. "Sir," whispered his aide, a young Thylorian named Genkar, whose blue skin had turned pale with fear. "Half our fleet is already infected with the plague. The energy-dampening fields aren't holding. Our crews are." "I don't care," Thalos snapped, his tail lashing behind him like an angry whip. "Those savages cannot enter civilized space. Not after what they did to the Krellin system. Not after the massacre at Vorthan Prime. Not after he stopped himself before he could list all of humanity's crimes." The list was long, bloody, and entirely beside the point. Because right now, those same savages were racing through space to save lives. While he was trying to stop them, the main tactical display suddenly flickered, replaced by a face that made every being in the command center take an involuntary step backward. Admiral Jack Morrison looked exactly like what he was, a predator, wearing a human face. His ice blue eyes seemed to look directly through the screen at each of them personally. cataloging weaknesses and calculating kill probabilities. Behind him, the bridge of the Vengeance hummed with deadly efficiency. Thalos could see human officers moving with that fluid grace that came from decades of combat experience. Their uniforms were practical rather than decorative, their expressions focused rather than ceremonial. These weren't parade ground soldiers. These were killers. Galactic Command, Morrison said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. We received a distress call. Stand aside. The simple words hit the command center like a physical blow. No threats. No demands. No negotiations. Just a statement of fact, delivered by someone who'd already made his decision and wasn't interested in debate. Thalos felt his war crest flatten against his skull as primitive fear warred with civilized outrage. Morrison wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't even demanding it. He was simply informing them of what was going to happen. Never. Thalos snarled, forcing his crest back up through sheer willpower. You're exiled criminals, monsters. The Galactic Council voted unanimously to banish you from civilized space for crimes against. Morrison's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of emotion crossed those terrible blue eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Maybe, but we're the only monsters who can save your children. The transmission cut to black. For a moment, the command center was silent, except for the whisper of air recyclers and the soft hum of computers. Then Lieutenant Velkos spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Sir, ... They're not slowing down. The tactical display reformed, showing the human fleet as a wall of red contacts racing toward the Meridian Gate. The galactic defense ships were arranged in a defensive formation that looked impressive on the screen but suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper in a hurricane. All ships, Talos commanded, his voice cracking slightly. Open fire the moment they cross the boundary. Full spread, maximum yield. Stop them at all costs. But even as he gave the order, he knew it was useless. You might as well try to stop a tsunami with a fishing net. The first human ships reached the defensive line, and space lit up with weapons fire. Plasma bolts, particle beams, and quantum torpedoes filled the void between the fleets. The human shields flared and sparked under the assault, but they didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They just kept coming. Sir, gasped Commander Zorax, his crystalline surface flickering with disbelief. They're not firing back. They're just ... pushing through. It was true. The human ships absorbed the defensive fire like sponges soaking up water, their shields redistributing energy, and their hulls shrugging off impacts that should have vaporized them. But they weren't returning fire. They were simply moving forward with the inexorable force of a glacier. Sweeping aside anything in their path, the Vengeance led the formation, her massive bulk dwarfing the smaller galactic defense vessels. As Thalos watched in growing horror, she simply nudged aside a Centaurian cruiser with her forward shields, sending the smaller ship spinning away like a child's toy. They're not attacking, Velkos whispered in amazement. They're just moving us out of the way. It was humiliating. Worse than humiliating, it was dismissive. The humans weren't treating them as enemies worthy of combat. They were treating them as obstacles to be swept aside, irrelevant to their real purpose. One by one, the galactic defense ships found themselves displaced, their firing solutions disrupted, their formations broken. The humans flowed through their lines like water through a sieve, unstoppable and utterly focused on their destination. Sir, Commander Zorax said quietly, perhaps we should? No? Thalos roared. I will not be brushed aside by exiled criminals. All ships, ramming speed. If we can't stop them with weapons, we'll stop them with... He never finished the sentence, because at that moment, the plague reached the command center itself. The first sign was Lieutenant Velkos suddenly doubling over, his 4 eyes dimming as the shadow plague began consuming his life force. Then Commander Zorax started flickering, his crystalline body losing coherence as the plague turned his ordered structure into chaos. All around the command center, beings of pure energy and crystalline perfection began to fade, their very existence being devoured by something that shouldn't exist in a rational universe. Thalos watched his staff dying around him and felt something break inside his chest. These were good people, brave people. They'd dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent, and now they were paying the price for the galaxy's arrogance. On the tactical display, the human fleet continued its inexorable advance toward the plague worlds. 300 ships carrying 60,000 of the most dangerous beings in known space, racing toward certain death to save people who'd cast them out into the darkness. And suddenly, Thalos understood. They weren't criminals. They weren't monsters. They were exactly what they'd always claimed to be, protectors willing to face anything to keep children safe, even if those children belonged to people who hated them. All ships, Thalos said quietly, his voice carrying across the dying command center. Stand down. Let them pass, sir. Velkos gasped, his form already beginning to fade. Let them pass, Thalos repeated, watching the human fleet disappear into the heart of civilized space. God help us all, but let them pass. The humans carved through space with terrifying purpose, their destination clear. Behind them, they left a defensive line in shambles and a galaxy's preconceptions shattered beyond repair. The Deathworlders were coming to save the day, whether anyone wanted them to or not. The transport's engines whined as Dr. Amanda Cross felt her stomach drop during atmospheric entry. Below them, the planet that had once been called Paradise's crown looked like something from humanity's darkest nightmares. What should have been a jewel of crystalline cities and floating gardens was now a wasteland of shadow and death. Amanda pressed her face against the viewport, watching the landscape scroll by beneath them. The famous crystal spires of Thylo's architectural marvels that had taken 3,000 years to grow were cracked and blackened like burnt bones. The singing gardens, where alien children had played among flowers that chimed like bells in the wind, stood silent and dark. Even the very air seemed wrong, thick with something that made her instruments scream warnings she'd never seen before. Jesus, muttered Sergeant Tom Baker from the seat behind her, his rifle ready, despite this being technically a non-combat mission. Baker was built like a brick wall, with a Boston accent, and Amanda had never seen him look worried before. Today, his weathered face was pale beneath his tactical helmet. It's like a graveyard down there. He wasn't wrong. The plague hadn't just killed the inhabitants, it had killed the world itself. Plants that should have glowed with bioluminescent life were withered husks. The famous floating platforms that housed the Thylorian cities had crashed to the ground, their anti-gravity systems failing as the plague consumed the energy that powered them. Even the ocean, visible in the distance, looked wrong black where it should have been blue, still where it should have been alive with motion. Amanda's medical team sat in grim silence around her. 8 of humanity's best xenobiologists, combat, medics, and plague specialists, all hand-picked for this mission. They'd volunteered knowing full well it might be a one-way trip. The plague was killing energy-based life forms in ways that defied every law of biology they understood. But they were here anyway, because that's what humans did. They ran toward the danger when others ran away. ETA, to landing zone, 2 minutes, called the pilot over the intercom. Atmosphere is breathable, but recommend full hazmat protocols. Whatever's down there, it's not playing by the rules. Amanda checked her equipment one final time. Medical scanners, sample containers, emergency surgical kit, and most importantly, the experimental serums they developed during the journey from the rim. 30 years of exile had given humanity access to things the civilized galaxy had never dreamed of: biotechnology stolen from hostile aliens, genetic modifications banned by galactic law, and most importantly, an understanding of chaos that came from living on the edge of survival. The transport touched down in what had once been Thylos City's central plaza. Through the reinforced windows, Amanda could see the devastation up close. Buildings that had stood for millennia were crumbling, their crystalline structures losing coherence as the plague ate away at their fundamental bonds. Bodies lay scattered in the streets, or what was left of them. The plague didn't just kill its victims, it unmade them, turning their organized matter back into random particles. "Remember," Amanda said as her team prepared to disembark, "we're dealing with something that shouldn't exist. The plague targets quantum coherence itself, literally turning order into chaos. Our instruments might not work properly, our understanding of biology might not apply. But we're humans, and chaos is our specialty." The airlock cycled open, and they stepped onto the surface of a dying world. The first thing that hit Amanda was the smell, or rather, the absence of smell. The plague had consumed even the organic compounds that created odors, leaving behind a sterile emptiness that made her skin crawl. The second thing was the silence. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of life. Just the hollow echo of their footsteps on crystal streets that would never ring with laughter again. "Life signs," reported Dr. Sarah Kim, her xenobiology specialist, scanning with instruments that flickered erratically. "Faint, but there. About 200 meters northeast." They moved through the dead city like a military patrol, which in many ways they were. Baker's team provided security while Amanda's medics searched for survivors. But as they walked, Amanda began to notice something that made her blood run cold. The plague wasn't random. It was intelligent. The pattern of destruction showed clear signs of purpose. Buildings that housed weapons had been left mostly intact, while medical facilities were completely obliterated. Food stores remained untouched, but communication arrays were reduced to dust. Whatever this plague was, it knew exactly what it was doing. "Doc," called out Corman Martinez, kneeling beside what looked like a pile of crystalline fragments. "You need to see this." Amanda hurried over and felt her breath catch. The fragments weren't random debris, they were a child. A Thylorian child whose crystalline body was flickering between light and shadow like a dying light bulb. The plague was consuming her from within, turning her ordered structure into chaos one molecule at a time. Beside the child knelt a figure Amanda recognized from the desperate transmission that had started this whole mission. Healer Villana, her six-armed form hunched over her daughter, had aged decades in the few days since her plea for help. Her normally luminous blue skin was dull and gray, marked with the telltale black veins that showed the plague's advance. "Can you save her?" Villana pleaded, her voice carrying the desperate hope of every parent who'd ever watched their child suffer. "Please, you have to save her." Amanda knelt beside the dying child, her scanners confirming what she already knew. The little girl, she couldn't have been more than 7 in human. Years was maybe minutes away from complete molecular dissolution. The plague had consumed roughly 60% of her quantum coherence, and the rate was accelerating. "The plague targets quantum coherence," Amanda explained, her mind racing through possibilities. "It turns order into chaos, light into darkness. Your medicine can't touch it because it's pure entropy given form." Villana's light dimmed further. "Then we're doomed." "Not quite." Amanda smiled grimly, reaching into her medical kit for a syringe, filled with something that looked like liquid night. The serum was black as space itself, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. "See, humans evolved in chaos. We thrive on it. Our immune systems are basically controlled anarchy fighting." Controlled anarchy. The serum had been developed during their journey, based on 30 years of exile research that the civilized galaxy had never imagined. Human biology, it turned out, was uniquely suited to fighting entropy, because humans were entropy. They were chaos engines wrapped in skin, creatures whose very existence defied the ordered universe around them. "This is going to sound insane," Amanda continued, preparing the injection, "but we're going to fight chaos with chaos. Human biological chaos, versus plague chaos. May the best entropy win. She injected the serum directly into the child's fading core, watching as the black liquid spread through her crystalline structure. For a moment, nothing happened. The child continued to flicker, her light growing dimmer with each passing second. Then something impossible occurred. The shadow began to recede. Not all at once, that would have been too easy. Instead, it fought back like a living thing, pulsing and writhing as something even more chaotic than itself invaded its territory. Human antibodies, modified with biotechnology, that violated 17 different galactic laws, waged microscopic war against an enemy that shouldn't exist. The child's light began to strengthen, pushing back the darkness one quantum at a time. Her crystalline body solidified, regaining the coherence that the plague had stolen. Color returned to her features, and for the first time since they'd arrived, Amanda heard something beautiful, the sound of an alien child taking a breath. "My daughter," Villana whispered, tears streaming down her face in rivers of liquid light. "She's alive." The little girl opened eyes that sparkled like captured starlight and looked up at Amanda with the universal expression of a child who'd been very sick and was now feeling better. She said something in Thylorian that Amanda's translator rendered as, "Are you an angel?" Amanda laughed, surprising herself. "No, sweetheart. I'm something much more dangerous. I'm a human doctor." Around them, the medical team was already moving to treat other survivors. The serum worked not perfectly, not completely, but it worked. They were actually fighting an entropy plague with controlled chaos and winning. "How?" Villana asked, helping her daughter sit up. "How is this possible?" Amanda stood, watching her team perform miracles across the dying city. Human medics worked alongside desperate alien healers, sharing techniques and comparing notes as they fought an enemy that had seemed unstoppable just hours before. "That's what we do, Doc," she said, feeling something fierce and proud burning in her chest. "We fight monsters, even when the monster is death itself. Especially when the monster is death itself." Sergeant Baker approached, his rifle still ready, but his expression showing something Amanda had rarely seen on his face. "Hope, Doc," he said quietly. "We're getting reports from across the sector. The Admirals deployed medical teams to 17 different worlds. Early reports suggest the serum is effective across multiple species." Amanda nodded, watching as more survivors emerged from hiding places throughout the ruined city. They moved slowly, fearfully, but they moved. The plague wasn't beaten, not yet, but for the first time since this nightmare began, it was retreating. "Signal the fleet," she ordered. "Tell them we need every medical transport they can spare." And Baker, "Yes, ma'am." "Tell Admiral Morrison that the Deathworlders just became Life-Worlders." But even as she spoke the words, Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. The plague had been too intelligent, too purposeful, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a terrible thought was beginning to form. What if saving these worlds was exactly what something wanted them to do? The morning light streaming through the crystalline dome of New Galactic Council Station looked different than it had 3 months ago. Softer somehow, less harsh. Admiral Jack Morrison stood at the observation deck, watching ships from a dozen different species patrol the nearby space lanes, in formations that would have been impossible before the plague. Human destroyers flew wing-to-wing with Tellurian medical frigates. Centaurian scouts shared sensor data with Earth cruisers. Former enemies now worked together with the easy familiarity of family. It had taken the near extinction of 17 civilizations to teach the galaxy a simple truth. Sometimes the people you fear most are the ones you need most. Morrison adjusted his dress uniform, the first time he'd worn formal blues in 30 years. The fabric felt strange after decades of combat fatigues, but today demanded ceremony. Today, humanity was officially coming home. Behind him, the council chamber buzzed with nervous energy. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy had gathered for what many considered the most important session in galactic history, the formal end of humanity's exile. The integration of Earth's forces into the Galactic Defense Network, the beginning of something that had never existed before, true interspecies cooperation, born from mutual respect rather than fear. But Morrison knew the real victory wasn't happening in that chamber full of politicians and diplomats. It was happening in the observation lounges, where human and alien children played together without a care in the world. It was happening in the medical bays, where human doctors worked alongside alien healers to treat patients neither species could have saved alone. It was happening in the engineering decks, where human pragmatism merged with alien innovation to create technologies that defied both their imaginations. The plague had been stopped, but the real healing was just beginning. Admiral Morrison? The voice belonged to Captain Emily Carter, his aide-de-camp for the ceremonies. Her augmented eye had been replaced with a more subtle implant. Politics demanded that the galaxy's former outcasts look less threatening, even if they remained just as dangerous. The Council is ready for you. Morrison nodded, taking one last look at the mixed patrol passing outside the viewport. 3 months ago, those same ships had been pointing weapons at each other. Today, they were protecting refugee convoys and hunting down the last pockets of plague infection. The transformation still amazed him. The council chamber fell silent as he entered. Every eye in the room followed his progress to the speaker's podium, some with gratitude, others with lingering suspicion, all with respect earned through blood and sacrifice. Morrison had faced hostile fleets and cosmic horrors, but standing before this assembly of former enemies felt like his greatest challenge yet. General Thalos occupied the Reptilian Confederation's seat, his bronze scales bearing new scars from the battles against the plague. Chancellor Morden's tentacles writhed with nervous energy as he represented the Cephalopod Alliance. Even the crystalline beings of the Silicate Collective had sent representatives, their faceted forms reflecting the chamber's lights in rainbow patterns. But Morrison's attention was drawn to a smaller figure near the front row. Healer Valana sat with her daughter Lenara beside her, both of them glowing with the healthy luminescence of recovered Thylorians. The little girl, barely 7 by human standards, waved at Morrison with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. Her mother smiled and nodded, a gesture that carried more weight than any medal or commendation. Distinguished delegates, Morrison began, his voice carrying easily through the chamber's acoustics. 3 months ago, many of you considered humanity a threat to galactic peace. You weren't wrong. A ripple of surprised murmurs ran through the assembly. This wasn't the diplomatic doublespeak they'd expected. We are dangerous, Morrison continued, his ice blue eyes scanning the faces before him. We're unpredictable, violent, and absolutely ruthless when protecting the things we care about. 30 years of exile didn't change that. It made us better at it. He gestured toward the viewport, where the mixed patrol was visible in the distance. But here's what you missed while you were busy being afraid of us. We're equally dangerous to anything that threatens innocent lives. The plague learned that lesson the hard way. The chamber remained silent, hanging on his every word. Morrison had expected political theater, diplomatic negotiations, and careful compromise. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart about things that mattered more than treaties or territorial agreements. The shadow plague killed 2 billion beings before we stopped it, he said, his voice growing harder. 2 billion children, parents, healers, teachers, people whose only crime was existing in a universe that suddenly decided their form of life was obsolete. Your fleets couldn't stop it. Your scientists couldn't cure it. Your politicians couldn't negotiate with it. Valana had tears running down her luminous cheeks as she held her daughter closer. Around the chamber, other survivors of the plague nodded grimly, remembering the helplessness they'd felt as death consumed their worlds. But humans could, Morrison said simply. Not because we're better than you, we're not. Not because we're smarter, most of you have us beat in that department. We stopped it because chaos is our element. We thrive in situations that would break more civilized minds." He paused, letting that sink in. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In the chamber, the galaxy's most civilized species had been saved by the beings they'd branded as savages. "You exiled us for being too violent, too dangerous, too willing to do whatever it takes to win," Morrison continued. "You were right to be afraid, but you forgot something important about violence. It's a tool, and like any tool, its morality depends on how it's used." General Thalos rose from his seat, his massive frame commanding attention. The reptilian's war crest was folded flat against his skull in a gesture of respect that Morrison had never expected to see. "Admiral Morrison," Talos said, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "We branded you monsters, Deathworlders, savages, unfit for civilized society." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "We are monsters, General. The question is what kind of monsters we choose to be."